Okay, hi, it's Mr. P again, continuing with video 2, lesson 2 of our series. So if you didn't get to watch the first short video, go back and watch that. So this is going to be probably about 10 minutes, just giving us an overview of the Jim Crow era. Some of it we've already looked at. However, there are a few things at the end of this video that are new that I did not go over in class yet. So just a reminder, we already looked at the way in which Jim Crow era emerged out of what are called the redemption governments of the South. Basically, the South, in their minds, redeeming in the white supremacist mind, redeeming the South from Reconstruction. Those white supremacist governments use law as a tool for oppression and to reestablish racial hierarchy. The way in which that happens is mostly through disenfranchisement and segregation. Black communities, of course, use laws established during Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, amendments, constitutional amendments established during Reconstruction, and the court system as a tool for resistance as well. So we'll highlight both of these in this video. This is a reminder that the name of this era takes its name from a caricature, not a real person. So the white performer, Thomas D. Rice, did a performance act mocking enslaved people and named that character Jim Crow. He performed in blackface, not the first to do so, but certainly popularized it in the 1830s. And therefore, this era takes its name from that caricature, not, like I said, not a real person. First way in which these redemption white supremacist governments in the South reestablish white supremacy is by disenfranchising Black voters. So this means to deprive them of their right to vote. They do it through a variety of ways, which we've already talked about in class. Just remind you, through literacy tests, these quite absurd tests that would be administered to some folks who couldn't prove a certain level of education. And they were basically gotcha tests, things that don't quite make sense and therefore impossible to pass. Constitutional tests, so you have to demonstrate constitutional knowledge to be able to register. This was often also kind of like a gotcha test around very specific constitutional knowledge. Poll taxes, folks who couldn't afford to pay the tax to register weren't able to, vote. Grandfather clauses, these would be clauses put into state constitutions that would prevent people from being able to register to vote if they weren't registered before a certain time period, or if their, family, if they didn't have family or grandfathers who could register to vote during a certain time period. This effectively means that anyone who couldn't vote during the period of enslavement could not vote. And so this restricts a lot of people. And then, of course, violence and intimidation. So by 1940, only 3% of Black folks are registered to vote. And mind you, this statistic takes into account not only Black men, but all Black people at the time. Women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1919. However, only white women truly were able to exercise that during this time period. This quote from Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, helps us understand the continuity of disenfranchisement over time. So she writes about Jarvis Cotton and his family tree by mentioning that his great-great-grandfather could not vote as a slave. His great-grandfather was beaten to death by the Ku Klux Klan for attempting to vote. So that would have been during Reconstruction. His grandfather was prevented from voting by Klan intimidation. His father was barred from voting by poll taxes and literacy tests during the Jim Crow era. And today, Jarvis cannot vote because he, like many Black men in the United States, has been labeled a felon and is on parole. So Jarvis whichever state he's incarcerated in, has laws where if you're on parole with a felony, you're unable to vote. Those are all state laws. So she identifies the continuity of voting restriction and voter suppression over time, right? Not ensuring that there's always a group of people who are not considered full citizenship. The other way in which white supremacist governments implement and reestablish racial hierarchy is through Jim Crow segregation. So segregation is all encompassing. It infects every aspect of U.S. society, from public swimming pools and laundromats to water fountains and bathrooms, public transportation, motels, prisons. You'll see here in this list of laws, buses, right? Marriage laws, all across the country. And you'll notice that this is the language from Arizona. It's actually the same language in the California law at the time. So this affected Western states. It affected some Northern states. This wasn't just a Southern thing, although there were greater restrictions in the South. But like I said, Jim Crow is not purely a Southern thing. We want to, just like we did under slavery, we want to get out of our minds this dichotomy of a good and pure North and a racist South. The entire country, right, is built on kind of the white supremacist laws at the time. So we want to make sure that we're clear about that. To go back to this for a moment, remember, again, radical Reconstruction destabilized the racial hierarchy, mythology, and ideas at the time that were well established under enslavement. In destabilizing those ideas, it created for some white folks at the time a feeling that they needed to reestablish that hierarchy. Right, during radical Reconstruction, 2,000 Black office holders in power. Many of whom transitioned directly from slavery into leadership, political leadership. That ensures that they have, are really conveying to the world and to the United States that the way in which the racist mythology that slavery was built on was completely undermined and false. So Jim Crow era segregation is a way to reestablish that hierarchy during this era. So challenges to Jim Crow segregation occur pretty much immediately. So groups of Black attorneys tried to challenge it by using the radical Reconstruction amendments in their favor. So they used a strategy known as the test case strategy to fight back against Jim Crow segregation. So this is, let's create a situation where someone is discriminated against or segregated so that they have standing and can sue. So they recruit a man named Homer Plessy in Louisiana. Homer Plessy had a great grandparent who was Black, so he was considered Black at this time. He was white passing. Certainly folks on the street would not necessarily identify him as Black, but he was. And in recruiting a white passing Black person, they could ensure that he would get on the trolley, the white car of the train, and then once he revealed that he was Black, he would tell the conductor he was, and he did this. Then he was kicked off. Once he is kicked off in that way, he now has standing. Once he's arrested, and he now has standing, he sues to try and argue that the segregation laws that led to him being arrested and kicked off the train were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment equal protection under the law clause. So this is an effort to try and, end Jim Crow segregation using a court-based legal strategy. It does not succeed. The court rules that it is constitutional because the segregated facilities are separate but equal. We know that this is, in many ways a myth. Segregated facilities were hardly anything, hardly equal at all. And so, unequal resources, these were not equitable segregated facilities. And so this kind of provides a facade for the continuation of Jim Crow for decades to come. Another way in which the courts are used to defeat Jim Crow era oppression is to try and get rid of disenfranchisement. So the NAACP had formed in the early 1900s, and their first line of attack was the grandfather clauses. They sued in Oklahoma, took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and this time their strategy won. Gwynne v. United States in 1914 ruled that Oklahoma's grandfather clause indeed violated the 15th Amendment. It takes another 20 years for Oklahoma to take it out of their constitution. Nevertheless, this proved to the NAACP that they could use the courts to gather some wins. This will be important for future civil rights movement. Okay. The final reminder here in this kind of, reminder video is we already looked at racist caricature. And it's important to remember this because in many ways, Black art during the time period of Jim Crow is a response to the racist caricature of the time, which was, again, mythology, lies based on racist ideas about Black people, not based on real people. And so this caricature ends up justifying structural violence, legal segregation. For more information, you can go to the Jim Crow Museum. Many of you have already done that, so you don't necessarily need to, go back and visit that museum. It is a pretty heavy emotional experience, I think, exploring that museum because of the way in which racist imagery was used at the time period. So also, I just want to say that, in future videos, you'll see blue boxes like this with white text, which will have links that you can click on. So you'll be able to pause videos and click on those links. And if it doesn't work to click on it while the video is playing, I think you'll simply be able to pause the video, open up the slides that I've separately posted on Classroom, and then follow the link. So I know that some of you explored certain aspects of racist caricature. Just a few things to mention here. So over on the right, this text was published, and there were, other texts like it published to basically as a form of scientific racism to try and establish a racial hierarchy in which, and this was pretty common during the 1800s, where scientists analyzed whether it was skull structure and things like that as a way to establish that white people, and particular white folks, whether it was Greek or whatever, that they were the highest elevation of what was considered civilized. And then, and then they would place what they called Mongolian, which would refer to, generally refer to Asian folks, Black folks, etc. They would place down that hierarchy closer to the animal kingdom. And so this was a way to use science to justify racism. And out of that came and out of Reconstruction came a caricature of Black men as brutes or dangerous and aggressive. So that's one caricature at the time that justified segregation and justified separating people because the caricature was of danger. And it justified, membership in the KKK and all of that. You see here, right, salt and pepper shakers of what were caricatures of Uncle Tom and Mammy. These were caricatures of Black men and Black women who were subservient to white society. They were desexualized and considered just, their function in life was to care for and serve white people. That was a caricature that we see emphasized in certain brands like Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, Rice, those types of things. You see a game here that made fun of the caricature of what was known as coons. These were folks who were caricatures that of laziness and lack of work ethic. The child version of that would be the Pickaninny caricature, which was, of Black children who were considered, unkempt or dirty and lazy and dangerous. And this is on an ice cream carton. So these are just some of the caricatures at the time that will provide the basis for later Black reaction and resurgence of Black art in response. We'll see you for the next video.